Hello everyone and welcome to the 50th edition of the First Thursday Club. My name is John Davis. I'm a director at RSK Biosensors and RSK Wilding, and I think it's quite an achievement to have got to our 50th edition. We started back in August 2020, interestingly with a talk that was entitled Avoiding Boris's Newt Counting Delays to Build Back Green. Plus ça change, as they say. I think we can probably replace Boris with Rachel now, sadly. But over the course of the last 4.5 years, we've talked about everything from BREEAM, wildlife diseases and nutrient neutrality, to net zero, TNFD, and biodiversity net gain. Quite a lot on biodiversity net gain, as it turns out. So do please check our website for previous editions, or you can just Google First Thursday Club Biocensus, and that should work. Today, I think we have probably the perfect 50th edition talk, because botany underpins all of the stuff we do in ecology, and so I'm very happy to be introducing our speakers. I'll come to them in a second. I'm going to have to first, unfortunately, go through the normal housekeeping. So Sarah, if you could ping onto the standard next slide. So you are all muted for this talk, unfortunately, but your voice still counts, so do please put in questions into the questions box on your panel. I will go through those over the next half hour or so, sift through them and put them to our speakers at the end. I know we've got a lot to get through. I'm hoping we can get through as many questions as possible. If not, then Sarah and Richard, our speakers, have committed to respond to you by email if we don't get to those questions. One last thing to say is that there will be a feedback form as usual coming about an hour after the webinar. Do please fill that in, that would be great. So a quick introduction to our speakers. If you can go on to the next slide, Sarah, thank you. So we have Sarah Harmer and Richard Carter, who are both stalwart botanists from our Biosensors team, perfect people to be talking about botany and why it matters. So important these days with nature restoration and biodiversity net gain. I won't go through their biogs because they're on the screen there for you, but needless to say, they're the perfect people to talk to you about this very important subject. And I will hand over to you now, Sarah. If the two of you could turn your cameras off and we can get on with the webinar.
Brilliant, thank you very much, John. So welcome to everybody. It's great to see so many people interested in botany. I'm going to start by touching on the regulatory framework and how it's changing. Then we'll talk a little bit about what botany involves and what botanists need to know. We'll work through some examples to show you why that botanical knowledge matters. And lastly, we'll look at what needs to be considered as we move forwards. So in 2023, the government set targets for halting and turning around losses of biodiversity, and those targets were very ambitious. But their success relied on policies that are still in development 2 years later. Most recent State of Nature report gave some rather alarming statistics which show that the current approaches are not working, and so it looks like we're at a period of change to try to make things better. So in 2021, the Environment Act set out a framework for those legally binding targets that are supposed to be halting species declines. The delivery mechanisms are set out in secondary legislation, such as the biodiversity net gain statutory instruments. And that gave us a tool for mapping habitat and assigning a numerical biodiversity value to the habitat you've identified. And then you can use those values in standard calculations which measure changes in biodiversity, for example, pre and post development. There's been some more recent announcements which are kind of indicating that we're heading towards a period of significant change in the way that we deal with ecology for planning and development purposes, although the detail is still very sketchy. However, it looks like B&G will be staying and probably developed as a delivery tool, but that there'll be a move away from protected individuals of protected species and towards a more strategic habitat-based approach. And if that's the case, then it's absolutely vital that we know how to assess habitat accurately. as you'll see from our examples, getting this right requires some essential botany skills that we're going to talk about. So first of all, what is botany? And specifically for ecological consultancy, what are the key skills? I'm going to hand over to Richard to give you a little bit more about that.
Hello. Yes, well, regardless of consultancy, from a purely academic point of view, any botanist needs a certain skill set, and a botanical assistant, a consultant, needs all of that. First and foremost, obviously, a botanist needs to be able to recognize different plants, and identification skills involve good knowledge of plant morphology, which in turn involves familiarity with a lot of arcane terminology that's used in plant identification textbooks. Plus, an understanding of plant taxonomy, how plants are classified and named, and a good knowledge of identification techniques stretching to microscopy if you're going to tackle mosses and liverworts or lichens. Then a botanist needs an ecological understanding of plants, their habitat preferences, reproductive biology, and so on, which involves at least some knowledge of plant physiology and some knowledge of a whole raft of associated sciences, especially soil science, but also climatology, hydrology, perhaps some statistics. And then a botanist needs an understanding of plant assemblages, how plants fit together to form plant communities and distinctive vegetation types that are characteristic of particular habitats. And that's just the core stuff. A botanical consultant also needs to know about nature conservation evaluation, why some plants and vegetation types matter more than others, about habitat management, perhaps stretching to an awareness of land management practices, and habitat creation. From time to time, some even more specialized skills may come into play. A successful species reintroduction scheme, for example, to be viable may depend upon a knowledge of population genetics. I'll hand back to Sarah.
Thanks, Richard. So traditionally, most consultancy work was to do with ecological impact assessment in the planning process. Today, there's a lot more work in connection with compliance, for example, ecal work on construction sites. Even so, work around protected animal species continues to account for a large proportion of consultancy work. But increasingly, biodiversity net gain, biodiversity policy are creating new types of work that focuses on habitats, and getting this right requires expert botanical input. So what is that botanical input? What do botanists know? What are those magical skills and knowledge that make a good botanist? So we've tried to boil it down to 5 essential elements. Skills and knowledge both sit behind these. So we've got species, we've got habitat, we've got community, the significance, and then management and creation. They all work together. Obviously, habitat, species, and community are essential for site evaluation. Significance is how you're going to assess that value. They're all intertwined, and you'll see that as we go through some examples. But first of all, let's be clear about what we mean by some of these terms, particularly habitat and community. So habitat types are broad types such as woodland, sand dune, salt marsh, and those terms cover all of the environmental conditions, location, soils, topography, climate, together with the characteristic plants and animals that are found there. Particular assemblages of plants are the vegetation types or communities, plant communities. So particular vegetation communities are associated with particular habitats, so much so that they often define them. And this means that the two often get confused in people's minds. Being able to identify plants and the vegetation types that they generate is an essential part of describing and identifying the habitat type. So let's look a bit more detail at that first element of species. What do you need to know and how do you learn it? So people start by recognising the common and obvious wildflowers, and then maybe add in the small, kind of less showy, less obvious ones. If you know that there are two very similar species, you might start looking more closely at the parts of a plant to be able to separate them. Then you're going to need to be able to recognise those species when they're not in flower, and when they're growing in different conditions, and when they're not in perfect condition. After that, you might be brave enough to move on to some of the more difficult groups like grasses and sedges. To be able to get to the right species, you need to develop a scaffold of plant families and groups so that you've got a critical mass of understanding. And then this means that you know where to start with identifying an unknown or strange specimen. It also means that you know what you don't know and have an idea of what's likely, which links back to that understanding of habitat. It helps if you have a good idea of what species are likely to be found together, which links forward to the other element of community. Of course, to be competent enough to complete a survey, people need to be able to recognise the vast majority of the plants they encounter without needing to identify them, as there's simply not enough time to work through the books. So these are some places where you can start to learn that knowledge, and Richard's going to talk a little bit about the challenges of actually acquiring that knowledge.
So how would you go about producing a specialist botanical consultant ready-made, as it were? Well, actually, for many years, I did just that by running a one-year full-time master's degree course at the University of Reading. And our secret for success was simple. We concentrated on field experience. In addition to the usual amounts of lecture and lab time for such a course, we gave about 60 days of fieldwork teaching, a day per week and several residential courses. And the students did a 2 to 3 month fieldwork research project. Unfortunately, that course no longer runs. A young career ecologist trying to match that today will struggle doing it through one-day CPD courses, though of course those have their place. And yet I've known people become useful botanical consultants in 3 years flat and top flight in 4 to 5 years. And they're people who put in some time of their own to go out with local flora groups, rub shoulders with other botanists and learn their plants that way, who go on botanical excursions with like-minded colleagues, and who make wise use of available plant ID courses outside the workplace. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, in the early days of SIAM, most specialist botanical consultants were enthusiasts who were already very good botanists long before they thought of becoming consultants. And career ecologists today need to let a bit of that attitude rub off on themselves. Consultancy managers needing to upskill their staff need to know that there aren't going to be any very quick fixes. You can't produce a botanist who will be a safe pair of hands in just 1 year, unless of course they're starting from quite a high knowledge base. Consultancy managers need to understand the costs and the time that it takes to train a botanist, and they need to be able to support their enthusiastic trainees with adequate provision of training and the time to do it. I'll hand back to Sarah.
So the first step in ecological assessment, whatever the purpose, is a habitat survey. The usual method used to be a phase 1 habitat survey, which produced broad brush mapping of habitat types that could be completed by general ecologists. But in the last few years, this has been replaced by a more sophisticated system, UK HAB. And this allows habitats to be mapped and identified at successively more detailed levels. So level 2 is just grassland, level 3 is the main grassland types of acid, calcareous, neutral or modified. Level 4 is then subdivisions of those, and level 5 pulls out the priority habitats. And all this requires far greater botanical expertise than phase 1 needed. Traditionally, those junior or generalist ecologists could get by using phase 1 and then would call in an expert botanist for a more detailed assessment of any tricky habitat. And this approach was good enough as there was little regulatory emphasis on habitat, apart from protections for the very best and rarest habitat types. However, that's changed, and now best practice demands better botanical inputs. For example, the BNG metric needs to have habitat identified to level 5 of UK HAB. So you can develop your knowledge of habitat through courses, books, visiting lots of sites, so that you can recognise those characteristics, the difference and the variation. Junior career ecologists often run into trouble when they try to learn UK HAB before really understanding and appreciating the broad habitat that underlie the system. And after all, UK HAB and phase 1 are just ways of classifying and labelling those habitats. So competent ecologists need to know their habitats and then decide how they are best described in UK HAB terms. And it does take experience to do that. So in many cases, it's reasonably straightforward to get to the correct broad habitat type. However, risks do come with inexperience. For example, this vegetation shown here is dominated by grasses and it looks grassy, so it may make sense to classify it as grassland. However, these are agricultural weed grasses and they're growing in an ex-arable field, which had been sown as a legume ley, and that had failed, and then it had been left, which led to the invasion of this black grass. So though it superficially meets the criteria for grassland, it was actually a cropland habitat. And it was only through understanding and being able to recognise the grass species and the rest of the plant assemblage that this became apparent. So having the knowledge to get the habitat correct at the earliest opportunity is really vital. It matters for project design so that we're able to accurately signpost the likely value early on. The client actually wanted to use this field for biodiversity offsetting, which was a great opportunity for increasing biodiversity, but misidentifying it as grassland had huge implications for the project design. So if you can get to the correct broad habitat accurately, then getting to the more detailed subdivisions of UK HAB is also a bit tricky, even in some of the common and widespread habitat types. So for grassland, splitting off acid grassland, calcareous grassland, neutral grassland, modified grassland involves recognising the presence and also the abundance of indicator species. I will tell you if it's acid or calcareous, but then deciding between the third and fourth categories of neutral grassland G3 or modified grassland G4 can actually need some care. So you need to be sure that you haven't got any of the indicator species, or if you have got them there, they're not at high levels. And then you need to identify the dominant grasses, and that's going to require some skill. Then you need to record the number of species per metre, which means that you need to identify everything in the sward, including the grasses, to evidence your decision. And this can be really difficult, especially if it's mown or grazed. The animals obviously eat the forbs preferentially, and they eat the identifying features of the grasses as well. If it's winter, it's going to be even harder because the forbs will not be in evidence at all. So even with experience, grassland can be really difficult to determine, and misidentifying G4 as G3 or vice versa can actually have quite serious consequences when it's then fed forward into BNG calculations. So from the last examples, you can see that identifying plant species is vital for accurately identifying the habitat, even in the commonest habitat types. But for more valuable habitats, you're going to need a solid knowledge of habitat and species, and Richard's going to share an example.
So, looking beyond the little fence in the landscape photograph here, we have what looks like a very ordinary neutral grassland, unlikely to be of any importance. A closer look might initially seem to confirm that, because we would find that common grasses like ryegrass and creeping bent are dominant, and broad-leaved herb cover is below 20 to 30%. Moreover, you can see that the site is grazed by horses, which have trampled out large areas where you can see white flowers in the picture. That's scentless mayweed, which is a very common weed of disturbed soils. So we might think that this grassland is not only nothing special, but also in poor condition due to overgrazing. And that would be a consideration in any BNG assessment. And I guess some non-specialist consultants might leave it there and write this site off. How about a more experienced botanist? Well, out of shot, the site is adjacent to the tidal River Thames, so you might be watching out for interesting plants. Looking at close up at the sward photograph here, I can see among the buttercups some tiny little brown spikes of buckthorn plantain, which prefers saline soils, so that's a bit of a red flag. There might be other plants of saline soils here. And then the buttercups could easily be taken for the very common bulbous buttercup. But in fact, on close examination, they're the less common hairy buttercup. That occurs occasionally in a wide range of grassland types, but it's only constant and characteristic in coastal and floodplain grazing marshes. That's a second red flag. So at this point, I'd be quickly looking for meadow barley, characteristic of the same habitat. And though grazed down here, I would soon find it. At that point, I'd be worried about the possibility of another 20 or so notable species, nationally scarce species, red list species, grazing marsh indicator species, county rarities. And this site turned up about a dozen of those. It had red list vulnerable slender hare's ear and sea barley. It had sea clover, Borer's salt marsh grass, stiff salt marsh grass, corn caraway, ditander, divided sedge, knotted hedge parsley, and so on. It turns out it's a fine example of the priority habitat type, coastal and floodplain grazing marsh, with an outstanding complement of notable species. And most of those species require some degree of soil disturbance and bare ground, so that the horses, so far from putting it in poor condition, are actually maintaining optimal conditions for this kind of habitat. So if we had concluded that this site is nothing special, we would have been profoundly wrong. Back to Sarah.
So the third element is vegetation community. This is all the plant species present and their relative amounts. This is often termed phase 2 botany survey, but there's not really any such term. So the communities that you're going to come across are rarely perfect. Every species is going to be a variable, and there are going to be huge variations in conditions of soil, shade, nutrients, location, waterlogging, etc. There's also going to be transitions and mosaics between those vegetation types, which is going to mean that every patch looks different. So the National Vegetation Classification, or NVC system, published by Rodwell in 1990, aimed to describe all the different UK vegetation communities, and it consists of 286 communities of 578 sub-communities. You're only going to learn those by reading the books, really looking, recording quadrat samples in lots of examples of vegetation, and deciding what community you've got. So to identify your plant community, you're going to need to go out and look at homogeneous areas and take samples, quadrat recording, and list all of the plant species. It's really important to actually get down into the vegetation and record those quadrats, because it's the only way to really look properly. So then you compare your sample data with published tables of data in the books. Now, I didn't expect this grassland to be interesting. It was a sea of yellow ragwort, which was dominating the sward when I visited in the late summer. But I did notice a little flash of pink, and you can see there's a common century down at the front of this picture on the left. It's really heavily rabbit grazed, and they've preferentially eaten all of the forbs, which means that it's very easy to miss the small chewed acid grassland indicator species that were there. And it was only after recording a couple of samples that I realised that these indicators were actually present. And it was only after recording 10 samples that I could evidence that it had enough indicators in sufficient quantity to be a priority habitat type. But it was a slightly peculiar NVC community nonetheless. So our fourth area of understanding is significance. Once you've identified the plants and recognised the habitat and plant community, you need to put it all together to work out the significance. This is about understanding how important your species is and how important your habitat is. And that's going to be at different levels, at a site level, a local level, county level and national level. And it's important to understand here that there are shifting baselines. Some species are going to be more important in some places, and it's the same for habitats. So cross-referencing your information with county floras and BSBI records, distributions is really essential to understand the local significance. I think here we really need to touch on what irreplaceable means. It's not just the published list of irreplaceable habitat in the BNG metric, but it's those habitats and vegetation communities that it's simply not possible to successfully recreate that really are properly irreplaceable. So significance brings into play the wider function as well, how that habitat is acting in the landscape in terms of fragmentation, connectivity, community dynamics, etc., as well as the other species groups that might be found there relying on that habitat. So invertebrates, birds, other animals, fungi, bryophytes, all of those things come in to the significance of the habitat. Tools and information to help you build knowledge of significance as shown here. The Ellenberg values will tell you about the conditions that each plant species prefers to help you understand your vegetation. The BSBI maps will show you where individual species are found. Local knowledge shouldn't be underestimated here, and local floras are going to contain information that can't really be found actually anywhere else. So our final element of understanding is management and creation. And this element obviously relies on a solid knowledge of the target vegetation communities and the conditions that different species prefer. We need to understand local and regional variations, and we need to get all of this right to deliver real biodiversity gain and not just gardening. The fundamental premise here is to understand what's appropriate, what's possible, and how to get there. And Richard's going to give you some examples.
So there are many things one could talk about at this point, and what I'm going to talk about might seem a little tangential, but it's an illustration of where botanical expertise might come into play. And to start with a little cautionary tale, we have a picture of some dogwood here. And landscape architects have been specifying native shrub species plantings around housing estates, road schemes and so on for about 40 years now. You see the stuff everywhere you go. But Peter Zell, who wrote the one of the big floras of the British Isles, about 15, 20 years ago, started to point out that actually, when you looked closely, the species that had been planted weren't the native species at all. And what we have here is a picture not of British native dogwood, but of Asiatic dogwood, which is a closely related subspecies, but not our native plant. And similar things have happened with other things that go into these plantings, with the field maples, with the Guelder roses, and so on. Lookalike species have been put in instead because there was no botanical expert anywhere in the process, through from design to procurement of material, planting, and follow-up monitoring. So we've got some pictures here now of plantings from wildflower seed mixtures, and these are extremely popular now, but they take some understanding. Firstly, we have here a picture of a beautifully colourful wildflower meadow, as you might call it. This is probably designed to be on chalk. And what we're seeing is very high cover of a blue flower called field scabious, very high cover of a white flower, which is wild carrot, moderately high cover of another pink flower called marjoram. And if this were in an urban nature reserve or close to the car parks in a country park where it has huge amenity value, I don't think you could take exception to this. But if this were supposed to be compensation for the loss of old chalk grassland, I think you'd be horrified, because there is no natural vegetation in the British Isles that combines large amounts of wild carrot, field scabious and marjoram. Wild carrot tends to grow in rather disturbed places. It's never an abundant plant in natural grasslands except sea cliffs. The field scabious, again, occurs widely, but in small amounts across rough grasslands. Marjoram tends to be on shrub grassland margins. So this assemblage is nothing that you would ever find naturally. So it has its possible applications. But a good botanist would be able to spot these unnatural assemblages. And the problems go a bit further than that, and I think this is one for the future in a way. Very often the plants that are planted in this way are different from the genuine native plants. So we have two pictures of the yellow flower here. It's bird's foot trefoil. Native bird's foot trefoil is an almost prostrate to weakly ascending plant, doesn't get much above 6 inches high. The yellow flowers often have a strong tinge of orange to them. And the widely planted bird's foot trefoil, which you see everywhere on road verges and so on, is sub-erect, gets to a height of about 14, 15 inches, almost knee-high. And it's obviously a different plant. Now, it's only a matter of time before these things get named, and then what we thought were native wildflower plantings suddenly become plantings of non-native domesticated varieties. So that's one for the future. I'll pass you back to Sarah.
So, where can you learn those skills? Understanding what's appropriate is going to start with your national character areas, biodiversity opportunity areas, combined habitat mapping and nature recovery strategies. They're all going to point you in the right general direction. You're going to need to understand the site's soil. The underlying geology, hydrology and land use history are all going to come into play here. They're all going to influence what you've got on your site and what's appropriate for your site. Once you understand the site conditions, you're going to need to understand what's possible given those conditions. Only some of those conditions are going to be able to be realistically changed. So when creating habitat, we need to understand what's just gardening, planting some things that might be nice, and what's actually going to result in a recognisable and valuable community. And so we've got to shift our focus from planting a collection of species, however appropriate those species are, to understanding and creating the correct conditions and putting in place the correct management to allow a self-sustaining and natural habitat to develop. We need to try things out and monitor the results so that we know what's successful and why it's successful. And this needs to be shared so that we can develop industry knowledge as quickly as possible and start delivering real gains and making a real difference. There's a wealth of knowledge in nature conservation colleagues, and we need to be sharing and understanding that knowledge. So hopefully you can see how botany underpins habitat identification, evaluation, management and creation, and that's why it's so important. And now you understand why botany matters. Here are our take-home messages. So there's not enough skills or people currently, and we need to upskill our botanists. It's not a short-term process, and it's going to require investment from individuals, industry, academia. There's Identiplant and FISC, which is going to help standardise those species identification skills. We need to develop the strategic approach here. If it's going to be successful, we need to add more detail to the information we've already got. and we need to make it really applicable to the local area. We need to champion that local variation. Currently, local provenance is seen as a nice to have rather than a necessity in some schemes, and local is more difficult to deliver, but we need to really appreciate that so that we don't create uniform artificial communities that are the same everywhere. We need to develop our understanding of habitat creation and management so that we accept what's irreplaceable and we understand what's realistic and possible. We need to understand the conditions more fully so that we're not just gardening, but we're creating that more natural habitat. The same ecological restoration interest group will be publishing guidance later this year. We also need to learn and share our knowledge so that everybody in the industry can move forward together, understand those failures and successes so that we can make a real difference to biodiversity and deliver schemes that are really valuable. So I'm going to hand back to John for the questions.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. If you want to ping your cameras on. Really fantastic talk. I just think you're really emphasising how important it is, if we're to get this nature restoration right, which we're all getting terribly excited about, we can't just bludgeon forward without understanding, you know, the processes and the communities and the plants underpinning it all. And I think in consultancy in particular, there has been a risk of that, you know, that there's long been a sort of decline in the botanical expertise, it seems to me. And you've really put out a rallying cry for making sure that botany is done better. I've always said that botany and entomology, you know, the sorts of disciplines you need to have been doing since you're about 3 years old, basically. It's not something you can do easily. Certainly, if you're committed and you're coming in as a, you know, as a graduate, then it is something you can develop. So I wouldn't want to put people off if they wanted to get into botany, but it is a real commitment, stuff that you really have to do in your spare time. There's a lot to get done, but we have to do it right. So thank you very much again for that. We've got about 6 minutes for questions, so I'm going to pull rank since I'm the compere, and I will ask my question first, and then I'll go on to the others. So the question I had is there a place for less than natural species mixes in urban settings that are pretty and flower rich, much like the one you showed, Richard, in one of your pictures? Or are we not missing a trick here, since these could be both flower rich and natural?
If I could take that, I suspect the answer is yes and yes. There is a place if you're really trying to enthuse people who've had little to do with nature conservation before, then a big display of wonderful flowers, yes, that helps. And in urban nature reserves and country parks and so on, there's an argument for it. On the other hand, we really could be, as you say, missing a trick, because urban brownfield sites have masses of colourful flowers which we don't value because a lot of them are introduced species and so on. But they're quite recognisable plant communities, and I think they've been hugely undervalued in the past. I know that people in London Wildlife Trust feel the same way, or certainly people I've met in the past did anyway. I can't speak for the people today. Yeah.
I wonder if part of the problem is that we are a nation of gardeners, and you know, we're all used to a herbaceous border that, you know, is a certain height and has lots of flowers in it, and we're not, that's what we're tuned to find attractive, rather than something that maybe looks a bit messier and with a kind of a greater diversity of heights and whatever. You know, it's not what we're attuned to finding attractive, but I do think it's something we need to, you know, push for, to make these things, you know, more natural if we possibly can. Excuse me. Right. I have a question from Catherine Mitson, which is to do with survey effort for botanical surveys. So she says, I understand that a 30-metre linear sample is the norm for hedgerows, but in a grassland, how many quadrats of what size would be recommended, assuming the whole field is the same habitat type and condition?
Do you want me to take that one, Richard?
Okay.
So even in the most boring grassland, I would always do 3 1 metre quadrats, just to be certain and to evidence that it is boring, rather than just merrily saying, oh, it's G4, it's boring. I would always do at least 3, ideally 5. They're not going to take very long because there's not going to be very many species there. Anything that I thought wasn't G4 or could be questionably G4, I would do 5. And in something like that acid grassland, after I'd done 2 or 3, I realised actually this is really quite nice, and I went on to do 10, because you need to do 10 to meet the criteria for priority habitat, because though they use DAFOR codes for how abundant your indicator species are, those are kind of defined in a slightly different way for identifying a priority habitat type.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, we've got 2 or 3 minutes left. We've got another question from Jenny Foster, who says, if I can click on it, I find it interesting that for BNG assessments, you have to get a qualified ecologist or competent person to do it. There is no mention of using botanists in the process that I've seen. Disappointing, really, given the value you add. So that's a comment rather than a question, but if either of you would like to reflect on that, I think it's probably, she's made a good point. Richard?
Yes, I think it would be possible to get your BNG type wrong if you go out there without any experienced botanists. So particularly with the grasslands.
That's the thing that came out, you know, so my team is very much BNG oriented, and it really came out of your talk that we can get this really fundamentally wrong. I mean, your example of the floodplain grazing marsh was fascinating. It's so easy to get it wrong. And worth noting that this could make hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of difference to our clients, you know.
Yeah.
So it is worth investing to get a decent botanist to do the work for you. On the subject of floodplain grazing marsh, Tanya White has put in the question. So noting UK HAB has some wetland habitats in poor condition and some with no acknowledgement of poor condition. Should we infer that degraded floodplain grazing marsh, for example, should always be categorised as present if degraded? Not quite sure I understand that question, actually. Apologies if example is not accurate. Thanks, amazing webinar. Right, well, you can take the thanks, amazing webinar bit. Did you get the question?
Yes, I think it depends whether it's restorable or not. If you think you can get it back through management, then it still has a large part of its intrinsic value. If it's so far gone that it's never going to be the right thing again, well, yes, and that's often a difficult call, of course. We have the same thing with coniferized ancient woodlands. At the moment, people generally take a precautionary view and treat coniferized ancient woodlands as if they could be restored. But I'm sure some can't.
Yes. Okay, we've probably got time for one more. As I said, Richard and Sarah very kindly offered to answer any other questions that we don't get round to. I'm going to ask this one, or we can have a brief discussion about this. So this is, would you like to comment on the habitat regulations reform or the delivery plan changes in the nature restoration working paper? That is quite a political question. What I would say, so I'll lead the answer if that's okay, guys, is that it is going more towards large scale habitat restoration, which from my perspective, I welcome. It also gives you more opportunity to do things right and naturally. The reason we have these little these areas of wildflower planting on road verges is that you've got a very constrained space, and you know that wouldn't really necessarily develop over time in its own right. So from my perspective, I think we're more likely to get landscapes that are the right natural habitat. But what do you guys think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the sentiment behind having a strategic approach is right and is a good one. I think that the detail is very important.
Richard?
Yes, I think what we have yet to see is to what extent might there be loss of protections to habitats that are really good. We don't want to see that. You know, the things that are irreplaceable or even verging on irreplaceable, one just hopes that they won't be threatened.
Yeah, what I would say is that with a consultation like this, it's well worth reading it. That we're going to respond formally from my team.
Yes.
You know, we've got an opportunity to get this right, so I would urge people to respond in their own right. Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Guys, thank you very much. Really, really insightful, and so important to emphasise the importance of good botany in ecological consultancy. Just to say that our next talk, which actually leads on perfectly from your fifth area, the kind of habitat creation side of things, is Tim Graham from my team in RSK Wilding, who's going to be talking about best practice in habitat restoration. So that's a very natural progression from your talk. So do tune into that in the first Thursday of March. One last reminder that there will be a feedback form coming to you all in an hour or so's time, so do please fill that in. If you've got any ideas for other talks for the next 50 First Thursday clubs, then please do, and we'll look at that. Thank you again, both of you, and wishing everyone a nice afternoon. Cheers.
Thank you, John.
Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John.